Well, it's a little bit later than usual. Normally, I like to, hand out these predictions on Tuesday or on Thursday, and it's a Friday, and that's really kind of all I have to say about that. So I'm here on Friday morning, like super early in the morning, and doing the predictions for UFC London that's coming up tomorrow. Apologies for the lateness. It was what it is. In a nutshell, basically, right now. So my dad had a medical scare, which delayed my film review for this fight card. And I'm also working a, temporary contract gig that requires me to be away from home. And as a result, there's a lot of like time going on there, like a lot of transit time, commute time, and just generally fairly long hours. But hey, the money is good. So, you know, do not cry for me. Let's get into the news real quickly here. So I have three news items essentially, although one's a multi-part one. The first is that so with the whole political situation around Russia, we've seen Glory release their Russian fighters, and the combat sports fandom has been basically kind of playing devil's advocate, I guess is the word, of like, okay, what does this mean for UFC fighters? What does this mean for people who are associated with a country? Is it right to deny someone a visa because of where they're from? This is somewhat ironic because where you're from has been enough to deny people visas at various points due to political turmoil. This is not terribly new. And Zubair Tukhugov was recently taken off a UFC card for visa issues. And people have been using this as like, all right, this is going to affect the UFC. This is a big deal, blah, blah, blah. Here's the problem. One, the UFC's had UFC fighters on or Russian fighters on most of their fight cards in recent memory. So that would point towards this not necessarily being particularly more difficult to book Russian fighters. Two, we're looking at this like this is the first time Tukhugov has had visa issues. We're ignoring that Tukhugov is a fighter who has fought for the UFC on American soil only one time and has long-standing, pretty much since day one, visa issues in regards to, I have heard various different theories as to why. Possible criminal connections, possibly even terrorist connections being in there. I don't know the facts, so I'm not going to state anything as a fact beyond that there is something in Tukhugov's past or associations or whatever that has made him difficult to license for a fight in the United States of America. This is not new. The only surprise about him being removed from this card is that the UFC tried to book him on an American card. Now, supposedly he's been able to get in as a cornerman. He's been able to get in as part of a team. He's been able to train in the States. So there's something specific to the visa process in regards to getting a combat sports license that is a problem. But it predates anything between Russia and the Ukraine. That's really the only thing to really imagine about this. I don't think that'll change anyone's mind on the whole visa issue vis-a-vis Russian fighters at this point in time. Just that whatever problems he's had are longer standing. He is not evidence of something new right now. A couple of fight bookings. We've got Sean O'Malley versus Peter Yan. We've got Islam Makhachev versus Charles Oliveira. We've got Nate Diaz versus Hamzat Chimaev. The most interesting fight in the cage is the least interesting from like any kind of comment here. I don't usually talk about fights being made because one, they often do fall apart. Two, it kind of ruins the eventual hype of like a prediction video. So I'm not going to talk much about these fights necessarily, but the situation surrounding them is kind of interesting because, of course, with Makhachev and Diaz, there's always been this Islam hate army, and then there's been this Islam sort of rub off from Habib army in the fandom that are clashing. I don't find myself overly agreeing with either of them, and I've said this before. when people were like, Makhachev has to get the next title shot. Not really. There were other candidates. His resume is not that amazing. But there are also people that are like, well, he's done nothing to deserve a title shot. Okay, but who is your other plan? Because short of recycling Charles Oliveira's opponents, there's no one that has a particularly stronger resume. I would say Islam has the strongest resume of UFC lightweights that have not actually fought for a title before. So he's the best fresh competitor. Not an undeniable resume. Yes, beating Dan Hooker and Arman Tsarukyan are not necessarily title shot things, but Hooker was beaten by Michael Chandler in a number one contenders match. And people are even like talking about Mateusz Gamrot as a more worthy challenger, despite the fact that his biggest win is also Arman Tsarukyan. So I think people are being completely disingenuous on the topic. Looking forward to the fight. Interesting. It's in Abu Dhabi. A lot of people are making a bit more of a big deal about the Fight Island aspect because they're trying to like say that this is weighting it towards Islam. The judges will be with him, the cutmen, the refs, etc., etc. I would encourage people to go look at all the Fight Island cards and realize that while there is some local officiating used, we've seen referees from that area, we've seen judges from that area. The big fights, and a title fight would certainly be that, a main event of a pay-per-view would certainly be that, are refereed, judged by the usual faces, which means the judges are still incompetent, but they're the same incompetent judges you would get in the United States. And that goes for most foreign markets. There is you'll see some faces you don't know, some local judges, local refs, but the big fights will be the established crew. Probably Mark Goddard, I'd imagine, for Fight Island. But anyways, the other two fights are more like kind of famous for like both of them just being kind of like inappropriate for where they are. Like O'Malley jumping up from a no contest with Pedro Munoz to fighting the former champion, and Nate Diaz, who the UFC themselves have been very big about saying 1 win in 5 years or 6 years, whatever it is, fighting the guy who just beat the number 3 guy in the division. On some rankings is as high as the number 2 guy in the world. I would say on the absolute lowest, he's like the number 4 guy in the world. And that's the fight you put together. So, like, both of those seem kind of ridiculous. And the fans on... Not so much... I'm not going to talk about Yawn fans. Like, the Yawn fan base is annoying. But on this one, they're... I hate to say correct. Essentially. But, yeah. With the O'Malley fan base, there's this weird thing of like, okay, O'Malley presents like physical power and reach and all of these things that we've never seen Peter Yan deal with, which is kind of ridiculous when you consider he did beat Corey Sandhagen fairly convincingly. So any thought that simply being tall is the weakness to Yan, I feel is quite ridiculous. And O'Malley doesn't even necessarily fight particularly well tall. I mean, think about the Pedro Munoz fight, realize the reach advantage, the height advantage in the play there, and realize that Munoz was still able to win a round on 2 judges' scorecards despite being a notably foot-slow fighter who doesn't necessarily have the best pressuring footwork. Yan is leagues above that. And that's led to just some weird takes. The other thing is, someone got me on Twitter by like talking about O'Malley fighting or training with Aljamain Sterling. They tried to use that as a gotcha because I actually believed them to a certain degree. Because the thing is that Sean O'Malley, as far as I know, has been at the MMA lab for a really long time, but doesn't fight like a lab fighter. Like in no way does he fight like what you would expect from his gym. So the idea that he would be training with somebody else, and the fact that it is hard to keep track of this stuff, really wouldn't even be surprising. I mean, honestly, if you're fighting Peter Yan, training with Aljamain Sterling, not a bad idea, as the only guy that's beaten him in a somewhat clean fashion. That being said, I think that there's nothing from the Aljamain Sterling fight that O'Malley can replicate because he hasn't shown a predilection for fighting like that. It would involve fighting very much against character. And then finally with the Diaz Hamzat fight, I'm not going to talk about the fight necessarily. There is this kind of weird thing of like, okay, so Nate Diaz has been at the center of like the UFC holding fighters hostage thing, and the UFC saying, well, we don't do that, except the examples of Randy Couture, Tom Lawler, numerous other examples have proven that they absolutely do hold fighters hostage, essentially by denying them the ability to do the work that they are most equipped to. Like, sure, a fighter on the contract with the UFC could go and get a job at McDonald's without a problem. And as much as I don't know of any that work at McDonald's, we do have the story of like Patrick Cummins working at a Dunkin' Donuts. I think it was. Might be wrong on that. It was a coffee place of some kind. I believe it was a Dunkin' Donuts. And they won't stop them, but like they can reject your ability to do anything that would, quote unquote, endanger your ability to work for the UFC. So any fighting for another MMA promotion, completely out. Boxing, completely out. Grappling, they've been more or less willing to allow, but they could even reject that. Kickboxing certainly would be out, and even pro wrestling requires a waiver from the company. So they absolutely do hold fighters hostage. And the fact that Nate Diaz's current contract, which was signed in 2016, was supposed to go for 2 years and it's still in effect in 2022, really should tell you the whole thing with that. Now, what I'm getting at is people are like saying, well, this is perfectly fine because Nate asked for this fight. By all accounts, Nate Diaz agreed to this fight, brought it to the UFC's attention, but this is a fight that Nate Diaz had turned down, I think 3 times documented before. The UFC has been pushing it on him since basically the GN3 Chimaev fight. And realistically, when someone is like, well, we should do this, we should do this, we should do this, and they're taking this up over a large period of time where they're trying to force this idea on you, and you finally agree, even if you start the conversation that leads to the agreement, that's not your idea. By definition, that is the UFC's idea. And the UFC is looking to damage him on his way out. And people have also stated that, like, okay, well, if he didn't accept a fight, he would have ended up being free in October. I don't know. I've seen conflicting reports on that he may have actually even extended his contract if he had refused another fight beyond October. That October is the current end date of his contract, or getting that last fight in. But the UFC has, again, managed to extend this for 4 years beyond its actual contract date. You'd have to say there's a chance that would still extend even further. And this is not a boo-hoo, feel bad for Nate. Nate's had the ability to probably fight this in court or do a great, to honestly do a lot more damage to the UFC by fighting this in court versus accepting and proposing this fight with Chimaev. So he's made his bed to a certain degree, but I'm just asking for a serious reflection on the events that lead up to the fight. And finally, there's a little note on fighter pay because 2 of the fighters on this card, Molly McCann and Paddy Pimblett, have both stated, and this is weird from Pimblett because Pimblett for the longest time was actually adamant that he would not go to the UFC without more money being involved. And his words here were that everyone starts at the same point on pay scale. Based on reported earnings, I don't think that's even true in Pimblett's case. I think he's actually making more from his beginning fight than the typical Dana White Contenders Series fighter or short notice pickup from a region actually makes. So I think honestly he's just straight up wrong. And McCann said the UFC, treats their fighters really well, first-rate hotels, travel benefits, and all this. And this is all probably true. Like I think the problem whenever this comes up is that the UFC usually gets defended in comparison to the rest of the industry, which is not a fair review of fighter pay in the UFC because the UFC is, look at the tallest thing in the room you're in, like a big shelf, 6 feet tall, 6.5 feet tall or something. That is where the UFC pay raise is on like a bar graph, or profits are on like a bar graph. And then look at like, I don't know, a shoebox. And that's the next largest industry. Like, that's the difference we're talking about here. The UFC can pay the most, treat the fighters the best, and still be underpaying them because they represent such a percentage of the industry that I've emphasized this again and again. The fact that Bellator has actually recently won several bidding wars for the services of UFC ranked fighters, Corey Anderson most notably. Yes, these are all fighters that the UFC kind of wanted to move on from, but the fact that the UFC was unable to just keep them shows again just how much they're not willing to pay when you consider the profit margins that UFC has versus what Bellator has, and they're not in the same ballpark. There is no financial document that in any world should create a possibility to sign a UFC fighter who is ranked. It shouldn't happen. That's the economic imparity we have here. Take you a little drink there. Anyways, let's get to the card before I go further on this. So obviously we got a pretty good card here, but it's an interesting card in the sense that while all the fights are interesting and very, very relevant, there is a serious question as to whether those fights are that difficult to break down. Like, I feel like I have a pretty good grasp on who's going to win most of these fights, even if I see a possible winner from the other corner, so to speak. Now, full disclosure, I did listen to a couple of my usual podcasts here that I usually do not listen to before doing this prediction. And particularly the MMA Vivisection by Bloody Elbow actually gave me a really, really... it really made me want to change my mind on one fight, but I'm going to stick with it. But you may hear some like topics or verbiage that were used in some other podcasts on this one, just because I'm doing it a little bit later and I didn't adjust my podcast listening schedule. So my apologies on that. We'll try to avoid that in the future. Let's get on with it, though. We got the main event, and that is Curtis Blaydes versus Tom Aspinall. I don't want to oversimplify this fight, but like it honestly, it kind of hinges on two things. Number one, how does Aspinall respond to Curtis Blaydes' wrestling? Because Aspinall has looked actually like a very, very good wrestler lately. Absolutely dominated Volkov. I believe, if I recall correctly, he absolutely just threw Arlovsky to the mat with ease. Like, there's an absolute wrestling game to Aspinall. But when you're talking about Curtis Blaydes, you're talking about the best or like second best takedown wrestler at heavyweight. So there's always going to be that question, regardless of who he's fighting, as long as it's not like, honestly, actually, as long as it's not like Francis Ngannou, there's always going to be that question of like, how does someone respond to his wrestling game? And how does that impact the fight? And then number two, how does Blaydes react to the speed and explosiveness of Aspinall? Because Aspinall is very fast, very explosive, and very powerful. And while Blaydes' striking has gotten better and better and better, pretty much every time out, his boxing has actually gotten to the point where he's an elite wrestler and an elite boxer in heavyweight MMA. He does have kind of this weird still like hitch that exists in his game. It's actually kind of gotten worse, where his transition from wrestling to boxing and vice versa is actually a little bit obvious. There are some physical tells when he's about to do it. And that means that when he goes for a takedown, anytime you go for a takedown, you're a little bit vulnerable to getting hit really, really hard. But when there's a tell that will allow you or allow the opponent to see when that's coming, means that window of opportunity, that counter window, is going to get very wide. And that's the question, is if Aspinall hits him really, really hard in the transitional phase, what happens? And Aspinall is also a very good grappler. We've kind of seen that despite the fact that he was really heralded as a kickboxer coming in, his BJJ is excellent, very good. And to a degree, I guess this is a little bit of a Fiziev RDA situation where, of course, I picked RDA on the basis of I don't know that Fiziev can stop his takedowns, and then he went out there and did it. And I've been bouncing back and forth on this fight. Initially, I was like, okay, Curtis Blaydes is a way better wrestler. And it's hard to find somebody to prepare for that, because the thing is that when you're talking about preparing for a wrestler, like even a Khabib Nurmagomedov, for example, you're at least in a weight class that has deep, deep, deep wrestling talent. That there is a lot of lightweight-sized wrestlers in the world competing on like an Olympic level or an NCAA level or an international level, whatever the case may be, or even a national level, that are actually somewhere in the same ballpark of Khabib and that you can prepare for. At heavyweight, that is really, really lacking. And that is the one advantage I keep thinking Curtis Blaydes is going to have over most people, is that not only do you not have the wrestling background of him, you're going to have a hard time finding training partners and sparring partners to help you prepare for that kind of wrestling. But then part of me is like, but Aspinall is really amazing. Looks like a legitimate, scary prospect. Powerful. Strong. Hits hard. Explosive. Fast. Can grapple. Can strike. These are all really scary things. And Blaydes has been caught. Like I said, there is that transitional hitch to his game that can be exploited. And that is actually why I'm going to go with Tom Aspinall. It's I think people might be a little bit surprised because, I was the one that said, like, I can't believe Fiziev's going to shut down RDA's wrestling until I kind of see it. Here, I don't necessarily think he's going to shut down his wrestling per se. I do believe that Aspinall is going to be put on the ground. I do believe Blaydes will have success both in the boxing and in the wrestling exchanges. I just cannot shake that there is a window of counter opportunity for Aspinall to use, that he has all the physical capabilities and I think most of the technical capabilities to absolutely exploit. Land some good shots. Maybe it's a club and sub. Maybe it's a straight up knockout. Maybe it's in a try-to TKO. But there's a lot of ways for Aspinall to win this fight. And I also am a big believer that the home crowd, which you will have in London, England, is something he can feed off of. I think he does feed off of it. I think some people crack under it and break under it. I think he takes power from the crowd. So yeah, I am gonna go with Tom Aspinall. And apparently this is not the hot take I thought it was. Because here I was thinking I would at least be taking the underdog. I'm not. Aspinall's minus 135 favorite. Blaydes is a plus 115 underdog. Like it's really close. Like this is a I'm just gonna quickly look at it here. Is this the closest line on the card? I see one closer. I think only one fight on this card actually is a closer line. Looking through this, and everything, mostly there's a couple of big lines, but there's a fair number of close lines on this card. Yeah, no, this is the second closest line on the card. The closest to the next fight, actually. So there you go. I am going to do that. I am going to take Aspinall, even though I was kind of hoping this would be like kind of against form, but apparently not. Apparently a lot of people have had this like sort of same come to Jesus moment when it comes to Aspinall and believing not necessarily the hype, but like the promise at the very least. It still has to be said that the best wrestler he has fought and beaten is Sergey Spivak, and it was a fight that did not really take the form of a wrestling fight. So there are a lot of concerns here. Jack Hermansson versus Chris Curtis. There's a couple of things to really think about here. Hermansson is a striker that is incredibly jab reliant. He really, really, really is a guy who thrives on his jab, and when it's neutralized, his striking kind of really stagnates and nothing really builds. and he has a hard time jabbing against southpaws. Chris Curtis is a southpaw. Now, it's not been be a southpaw, beat him. Jack Hermansson does have wins over GM3, Scott Askin, and Kelvin Gastelum, all of whom are southpaws. But Gastelum was very much the arbitrator of his own destruction by, engaging in a super long grappling exchange with him and getting, I forget if it was a knee bar or a heel hook now, but some kind of lower body submission. And then like GM3 is just not athletic, not a particularly good striker. And so Ask Him is like the closest application here. But Chris Curtis is a pretty creative striker. He's got a good jab. He's got an excellent counter game, which Hermansson is open to. He's got a really solid takedown defense, 26 out of 26 in the 26 out of 26 officially in the UFC on takedown defense. Although there was one moment where I think Brendan Allen really should have been credited with a takedown, but admittedly he didn't hold him down for very long. Curtis got back up. So good takedown defense, good get up game. Not a bad grappler actually in his own right. And Hermansson does not have the greatest wrestling game. Hermansson's wrestling game is that of a BJJ fighter or a grappler's game predominantly. He doesn't have great shots. He needs to kind of get the clinch and kind of work and hustle for it and have a willing grappling opponent. And one would think that Curtis, smart enough, technical enough, and comfortable enough on the feet that he's not going to be terribly willing to grapple. This reminds me a lot of it feels a lot like the Brendan Allen fight that Chris Curtis had, and he won. He won that fight. And he also beat Ronaldo Vieira. I thought Vieira would beat him. That was the fight that kind of really started to turn me around. This is a late notice fight, but Curtis is not a big weight cutter. Guy who seems to stay very fit all around and has the mindset and the mental toughness to be a really, really tough guy to beat even on short notice. So I'm taking him by decision here. Hermansson's super durable and super tough, so I think he'll see the final bell. But I just don't know what he can implement in terms of an offensive game consistently, or at least the best parts of his offensive game consistently. So there is that. Hermansson plus 100 and minus 120 for Curtis. That is the tightest line on the card. Next up, we have Paddy Pimblett versus Jordan Leavitt, and I will freely say I'll be cheering for Jordan Leavitt in this fight because, one, there's a certain dislike for Paddy Pimblett and his fans, and to be clear, it's more the fans. Like almost any time, it's almost always more the fans because with the fighters, it's like, you know what, you go out there and you get that money, you find any value you can find against the UFC. I am pretty well down for. So, can't hate it. But the fans, sometimes it's a little bit ridiculous. And the Pimblett fans are not super ridiculous. I think a lot of them actually do realize that he's not going to be a champion. Probably not even going to be top 15 at any point. That there are a ton of flaws in his game. He's kind of a formed prospect. And they don't believe the whole, I'm from Liverpool, I can't be knocked out. That is the only Scouse accent I'll try. It's bad, I know. And the other part of it is that I really want to see what Leavitt has planned for his celebration because we do know that the UFC told him not to do something. And the argument is, did they tell him not to twerk? Or is the argument that he actually had something way, way bigger planned? So if he wins and he twerks and the UFC makes a massive deal about it, then they told him not to twerk. I'm morbidly curious what the answer to that question is. But in cage, I don't see how you pick Leavitt. So the problem with Leavitt is that there's not a lot of physicality to his takedown game. I know he knocked out Matt Wyman, but I think honestly that says a lot more about Wyman than it does about Leavitt and Wyman's career over the last his last UFC run was terrible. It was really, really bad. It made Joe Selecki look like an absolute world killer. So, and if he can't get him down, because Paddy is not an A plus athlete by any means, but he's a guy who is explosive, powerful, strong, has pretty reasonable technique as a wrestler, and has a fair bit of power and explosiveness on the feet, which is effective despite the fact that his striking is a hot mess. But that's the difference, is that Leavitt's striking is a hot mess with none of the physicality that kind of like bandages over it. Whereas like Pimblett is like, I'm a hot mess, but at least I hit hard, and I'm fast, and I'm explosive, and I can find counters. He's incredibly bad at the start of the fight. So like Leavitt will get to hit him with like the ugliest 1-2 combination you've ever seen, probably right at the start of the fight. It's just that, unlike more powerful opponents or more technical opponents, it's just not going to really phase Pimblett all that much. I don't think that and Leavitt's impressive grappling, or at least finishes against guys like Matt Sales, for example, have largely come off of the other opponent just being really, by UFC standards and by lightweight standards, which is very, very high, being just kind of dog shit grapplers. And I have a hard time seeing how Leavitt wins the fight. I have a hard time seeing him knock him out. I have a hard time seeing him outstrike him. I have a hard time seeing him getting him to the ground enough, and Pimblett being mistake-ridden enough to get tapped. I don't see Pimblett finishing him. Leavitt does seem reasonably physically durable and is a very sound grappler. So I see Pimblett winning a decision. I hope not, because I want to see that celebration. And of course, at the same time, we've also heard that Paddy Pimblett would like to teabag Jordan Leavitt. But anyways, this fight is a minus 260 favorite for Pimblett, plus 210 coming back for Leavitt. That's a little wide, but I kind of expect that with Paddy fights. Nikita Krylov versus Alexander Gustafsson. Oh boy. I don't want to pick either guy. It's what it comes down to. I honestly don't want to pick either guy. If this were a matchup between two fighters I had a great deal of trust in, I would pick the guy with Gustafsson's skill set. Because Gustafsson is the longer fighter. I want to say he's the longer fighter. He's got to be. He's got 1.5 inches reach advantage. I thought it was a little bit more than that, but I'm not surprised it's that close. They're 2 inches apart in height. He's got the better reach advantage. He's better using it. He's a better competent striker in his prime. I think he's even a better grappler and wrestler in his prime. But the problem is that it's been a long time since we saw Alexander Gustafsson behave in a manner that indicates confidence, preparedness, and he's had a lot of physical injuries lately. I can't pick him, and it's all about him and not really about Krylov. I'm going to take Krylov by... Does he finish him? Because Gus is not... He's not become brittle, necessarily. He was finished by strikes by Anthony Johnson and John Jones, but like that's a different breed of fighter. He's been subbed by Anthony Smith and by Fabricio Verdum, both of whom are better offensive grapplers than Krylov is. But Krylov does usually finish people. I think he's only won by decision against Johnny Walker. I want to say it's literally his only decision win. Unless some of these like super early fights went the distance. I am kind of correct on that. Let's say he hurts Gustafsson enough and gets a club and sub. I will go with that. And Krylov's minus 190 plus 160 on Gustafsson. Do not bet that fight. Molly McCann minus 400 to plus 310 Hannah Goldie. It's about right. I'm not. I'm keen on what Goldie can be. Like, there's an obvious physicality to her that speaks volumes about what she can be. But at the same time, her fights just kind of leave me with this idea of like, okay, but what are you good at? What is your technical aspect that is supposed to win you fights? And don't get me wrong, at women's flyweight, just being physical might actually get you a couple of wins. Like, legitimately, might actually just get a couple of wins. But Meatball Molly, reasonably good. Volume striker. Persistent wrestler. Even if not necessarily the most physical or even the most effective. She is... How do I put this? She is aggressive, game, dogged, determined, hard to hurt. All of these intangibles, outside of like literally just being a physical specimen, she does have. And I think she'll win a decision here because I don't like Goldie's win over Emily Whitmire was her getting beaten by Whitmire until she caught an armbar. And otherwise, like losing to Diana Belbita, who, not for nothing, Molly McCann did beat. And losing to Miranda Granger, who is not a very good fighter. And again, kind of feels similar to like the athletic level of Molly McCann. So yeah, Molly McCann, decision because I don't really trust her to finish fights. I just trust her to like out scrap people. But yeah, that one feels actually really easy to pick. And at minus 400, she might be the biggest favorite on the card. I'm not sure if I would go that far. There are... Oh, no, she's not. Nathaniel Wood is minus 490. Interesting. And so is Mohamed Mokaev. That one makes sense. Mokaev makes sense. Slight spoiler for where we're going with that one. But yes, third largest favorite on the card. Paul Craig plus 125 against minus 150 Volkan Oezdemir. You probably have heard me say this a couple of times about like Paul Craig fights. He shouldn't win. There is no reason to pick him. He is a good, opportunistic grappler who does not necessarily have a physical or technical wrestling game to actually force people to grapple with him, and is not particularly threatening, nor technical, nor deep on the feet. And Volkan Oezdemir is a powerful striker, a good defensive wrestler, not necessarily a great defensive grappler, and that's the problem. If I could trust Oezdemir to fight smart, I'd pick him, no question. I think, and I am picking him. I'm picking him to knock out Paul Craig. But my lord, how many times have I seen Paul Craig snatch victory out of the jaws of defeat? The Ankalaev fight, the Krylov fight, the Jamal Hill, to a lesser extent, but Jamal Hill still. Antigulov, he did it as well, but like Antigulov will give almost anyone that opportunity, so like that doesn't really matter. And then like Kennedy Njoku as well. So like almost all of his wins. The only wins that he has is the Shogun win and the Maria win, where I think honestly his win was entirely produced by himself as opposed to the other fighter's stupidity and lack of fight IQ. I am hoping Oezdemir, proves me right and applies the dynamite that he has in his hands and gets a knockout. So there you go. Ludovic Klein versus Mason Jones. The Dragon minus 330 for Jones, plus 260 for Klein. This also feels like a really easy fight to pick. Klein is very, very good at a narrow segment. If you give him time, space, and let him control the pace, he's actually very, very good. Like he'll come at you with a lot of different unpredictable striking techniques, and he's actually not a bad clincher. He's not a bad takedown guy himself, not a bad defensive takedown guy himself. But bluntly, Mason Jones is more Nate Landwehr than he is Shane Young or Devontae Smith. Mason Jones will come out and he will push a pace on a guy. He will throw in volume. He will throw with aggression, and actually pretty good like combinations and variety. Like it's not just that he's using pace and activity to overwhelm you to avoid a long technical fight. It's that he's a technical guy who also realizes that in addition to his technique, he can utilize pressure and his physicality to make people greatly uncomfortable and emphasize the striking advantages he does have. I have concerns about Jones, both in this fight and long term, that I don't think he fights with a tremendous eye to defense. His style is inherently going to get him hit a little bit, but I think like even more than normal. Like there was a lot of times, particularly in the David Onama fight, where he was there to absolutely be hit, and it's kind of to a degree what lost him his fight with I always forget this guy's name, Mike Davis, the Beast Boy, Mike Davis, whose UFC career some reason does not happen really after that. I don't really understand, but anyways, that was a great example of like where he's just there to be hit cleanly and there to be hit a lot. But I don't think Klein brings the kind of output, and I don't think he's nearly comfortable enough with being pressured and being smashed into the clinch, which Jones will do to implement the judo aspects of his game, to actually do that. And I don't think he has the physicality either. So like, while I do believe Mason Jones is headed towards a knockout loss at some point, or a submission loss at some point for just being too aggressive and a little bit too reckless, I don't think this is the fight to do it. I think there's a chance of it. Klein does have that, he does have some power. He does have some creativity. He does have some accuracy, but he kind of needs that perfect shot. And I think Jones is just going to keep smashing into him, and it's just not going to happen. So Mason Jones, I'm taking him by decision just because Klein does seem to be pretty hard to finish in the way that Jones finishes people. I don't think he's been finished by strikes. Am I wrong on that? Decision loss. Yeah, 2 submission losses. I don't think I've seen the Aiden Lee fight. So maybe that one would change my mind, but like he doesn't really have Nate Landwehr's kind of like submission instincts, and even Landwehr had to kind of really go for it to get that anaconda choke. So yeah, I'm gonna say it goes the distance, but I think Jones should actually be a bigger favorite than his minus 330. Mark Diakese versus Damir Hadzovic, minus 305 to plus 255. I am taking Mark Diakese. Mark Diakese is like this really misunderstood fighter. Like I will never forget that fight with his last fight. What was it? It was against Slavoklas, Vyacheslav Borshev, where the commentary team was just so amazed that he was going for takedowns. I'm like, that's his game. He's like this super physical, rough and tumble wrestler guy who dumps you on your head and goes for like takedowns that really probably actually shouldn't work because he does not necessarily have great technique. Like I want to say that very clearly. He is a blunt instrument when it comes to the wrestling portion of the game. But he does have that physicality to get this done. If you want to see what this fight looks like, check out Damir Hadzovic versus Christos Giagos. I think this is very, 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 very similar. Hadzovic is kind of low output. Does have power. Does have power that you have to respect. But he's kind of like a low output striker guy who's going to be there to be taken down. Is reasonably good at avoiding takedowns, but people would just like that level of horsepower that Giagos and certainly Jacasey have been able to ground him, have been able to out-scramble him, have been able to do anything they want to on the ground. He's not a bad defensive grappler, doesn't get submitted constantly or anything, but he's a bit of a staller and not the greatest guy at fighting back to his feet or scrambling very well. So, yeah. He's coming off a win over Yancy Medeiros, but like this looks a lot like the Giagos fight, like I said, or like the Alan Patrick fight, or to a certain extent the Barebach Taisimov fight, and all of those were losses to him. The biggest physical aspect guy he's ever beaten in terms of the explosiveness is honestly nobody. His UFC wins are over like notably not very good athletes like Marcin Held, Nick Hine, Polo Reyes, and Medeiros is like really physical in the sense of like being strong and being exceptionally durable, amazingly tough, but there's like no real explosiveness or speed to him. And GKC has a lot of that. So we move to the biggest favorite on the card, Nathan Wood, coming up to featherweight to fight Charles Rosa. Or is he coming up to light? What weight class is that? This is featherweight. So Charles Rosa is coming down. Has Charles Rosa been at 145 before? He's listed as a lightweight. Looking for... Okay, he fought at featherweight against Damon Jackson and lost. And Justin James. Okay, so he's fought here a couple times. Charles Rosa is this weird guy. Like, I remember him for being like... incredibly stupidly built as a technician. Like, it's not that he's not technical. He has a good kicking game. He has a good combination boxing game when he likes to use it. He's actually got a decent grappling game, but like all of his applications are like wrong. Like, you know, kicking going backwards, leaving himself open for takedowns, being really willing to work from guard on the bottom and not actually try to turn his grappling into fight-winning sequences beyond like, maybe I can catch a triangle or an arm bar. It's just everything about him is built wrong for long-term success in MMA, and yet here he is, 20 plus fights in his career in the UFC, and a guy who actually has wins in the UFC, but like against similarly poorly built fighters in Kevin Aguilar and Justin James, and then a submission win over Manny Bermudez and a win over Kyle Bochniak. I actually like Kyle Bochniak, so that means something. And then Sean Soriano, who's just not UFC caliber, I guess is what we learned about him. Because if you'll recall, he debuted in the UFC against Tetsuya Kawajiri, who beat him, and there's no shame in that. Then he lost to Chaz Scully, then he lost to Charles Rosa. He got cut. Then he surfed around the regional scene, losing a couple of LFC, or losing in both CES and LFA, and then ending up back in the UFC, only lose to Christos Giagos and Shailen Nurenbeke. Like, he is 0-5 as a UFC fighter, so a win over him does not mean a ton. And when that's a career highlight, you got to ask some questions. And yeah, I'm taking Wood. Despite the fact that Nathaniel Wood is only 5'6", I always think he's taller. That's got to be a misprint. 6'9" reach, same reach as Rosa, despite the 3 inches of height disadvantage. He's got a good volume kickboxing game. It's got power. He's got a good top control game, good takedown game. Like I said, Rosa is really way too willing to just sit on his back and wait for openings. Wood shouldn't give them to him, and like there's a reason he's a minus 460 favorite. That being said, Rosa is exceptionally durable. This is a guy coming up in weight. I suspect this will go to the distance, and we're looking at a judge decision. A fight I don't think is going to be a judge decision is Makwan Amirkhani versus Jonathan Pierce. And the reason I have to say for this is that, number one, Amirkhani just doesn't really go to decision much. How many times has he gone to decision in the UFC? Ken Wallakirk. Edson Barboza. Surprisingly, Edson Barboza. That's surprising. Jason Knight, not surprised at that. Arnold Allen, Mike Wilkinson. Okay, it's happened a couple more times, I'm thinking. It has. But Amir Khani's way of fighting is like very much going for the gusto, going for the kill. And I'm surprised he's the underdog here. He's the plus 185 underdog to the minus 225 Pierce. Spoiler, I will be picking the underdog. So Jonathan Pierce's main advantage over most people is he's a big guy for the weight class. He's tall, he's long, he's strong. And Amir Khani doesn't have a problem with physicality. Dude is super physical, explosive, fast, agile, coordinated, throws everything with mean intentions and power, goes for submissions with mean intentions and power, and I think he'll submit Pierce because Pierce has been submitted, will put himself in bad positions. Like some of it is just physical structure. He has like this long, like giraffe style neck that like he'll, it's easier to get your arm under there. It's a bigger target. And some of it is just like not necessarily the best danger sense in the world. And I mean, if you can take out Mike Grundy, it feels like Jonathan Pierce is a less technical, better striker, but less technical, slightly bigger version of that fight. And I don't think anything from his past fights leads me to believe that he's going to win this fight. If he does, it's because Amir Khani does gas exceptionally hard. And if Amir Khani does not finish him, I don't want to say in the first round because usually you can get to the second round, but like within a round and a half, if he doesn't finish him, I guess Pierce will probably take over and I think might end up submitting him. But I'm a little puzzled by the fact that this is Amir Khani is an underdog. Little puzzling. Big favorite on the card, Mohamed Mokaev versus Charles Johnson. Minus 490 to plus 370. I am worried about Mokaev because I think he fights. I'm going to give you the Sergey Morozov speech. I think he fights in a manner that suggests that he thinks he's a better athlete than he is. And it's not that he's not a good athlete. Like he's an A-level athlete. But this is the UFC's flyweight division. Even the bad athletes are good athletes, if you get what I'm meaning. And there are better athletes than him in the division. I think he's in for a rude awakening at some point. He's young enough that he might just take that opportunity and build on it and become a better fighter off of it. I hope so. But I do believe he's going to beat Johnson here. Johnson is... he's a guy who's been used to having a lot of physical attributes over his opponents. Like if you look through his like fight catalog, of course, before the UFC, because this is his debut. And it's a lot of guys who seem actually like even smaller than him. Not necessarily great technical guys. He does have a good boxing game. He is pretty well-rounded, actually. But I do think Mokaev is a step ahead kind of everywhere. But at the same time, I'm also looking forward to this being a fight that tells me a hell of a lot more about Mokaev, because the problem with him finishing Cody Durden really, really quickly is it didn't really tell us jack. And his pre-UFC career doesn't really tell us jack. And that's not a knock. I think I've had this conversation with Habib, with people who hate Habib Nurmagomedov a lot, where, like, oh, you got to discount his entire beginning of the UFC career and that record. Do you do that with everybody? Because everybody has that. There's no one that's fought like a row of killers on his way to the UFC. Or like very, very few. Like you'd have to go back to the days when people came from Pride to the UFC to come up with someone whose pre-UFC record, or like maybe a Bellator fighter, is like absolutely loaded with like these fights that were really defining of them as a fighter. Like Mokaev beat regional level competition. That's what everyone does. But it does mean that there's a lot of questions I have about him. But I think he's a bit of a better grappler. I think he's a bit of a better wrestler. I think he's more apt to use kicks and knees and MMA striking tactics in a way that leads to a victory. And that's why I am going to have to take him here. I will say it's not exactly a great look when you like pose with a gun and direct a tweet at your opponent posing with the gun and they get really angry that he gets kind of like personal and starts talking about the street. That was a bit weird. Their Twitter beef is a bit bizarre, and I'm hoping it's not a sign of things to come. Anyways, I do think he's gonna win. Jai Herbert versus Kyle Nelson. Herbert is a minus 275 favorite to plus 230. I think that's a bit wide. Just because Herbert's issue is that he's a guy who's insulated by reach. In the sense that, like, he really does use it as a function of his defense. When you can get into the pocket with him or get into the clinch with him, there's actually a lot of hitting you can do. And Herbert does not have great durability. We've seen that in his UFC run so far. There's been some heinous beatdowns laid on him and probably life-shortening stuff with getting knocked out by Ilia Topuria, getting hurt by Renato Moicano, getting knocked out by Francisco Trinaldo. Like, these are all examples of fights, and even Kamaworthy clipped him a little bit, of him getting hurt and not having a great chin, and Kyle Nelson does hit really, really hard. I'm still picking Herbert. Still absolutely picking Herbert. I haven't decided if I'm going to pick him by decision or by stoppage. Because the problem is that, largely speaking, the way Kyle Nelson loses is by finish. Carlos Diego Ferreira, Matt Sales with submissions, Billy Quarantillo knocking him out. But I'm not yet convinced that Jai Herbert really has that kind of power at a UFC level. Like, big finisher on the British scene, does have a finish of Kamaworthy, like I said. But Kamaworthy's a guy who's been finished a number of times. I guess that also applies to Kyle Nelson, though. All right, I'm going to go with it. Herbert by TKO, second or third round. But the reason is that while Nelson does pack good firepower, strong in the clinch, like everything to his game is like power-based, there's no finesse to it. I think that Herbert is, despite being a really bad defensive fighter in the pocket, is deft enough and nuanced enough to see the sort of blunt hammer that is Kyle Nelson coming in, throwing with mean intentions, throwing with power, but also gassing himself out because he's probably throwing way, way, way too hard and not being confident or relaxed or composed in long-term exchanges. And I think Herbert, despite the fact that Herbert has every reason to be completely uncomposed by like how much shit kicking he's taken, is actually very composed in those long exchanges. And Nelson has a puncher's chance, but that's kind of like about it. Mandy Bohm and Victoria Leonardo. Now, this is the fight that the vivisection really did kind of have me rethinking, because initially my thoughts were pretty simple. I don't think Mandy Bohm is very good. I think she has some good things to her game. I think she has some nice shoulder rolls and some nice defensive tactics and some interesting setups to counters when she understands what her opponent is doing. When there's not a lot of variety to attack. But this is partnered with the fact that doesn't seem like a particularly good athlete, doesn't seem like a particularly technical striker or grappler, offensively speaking. Like, all of her technique goes into defense, which is weird. It's bizarre. This is maybe the only time I've seen that. And Leonardo, bigger, aggressive, has more minute-to-minute and round-winning tools through a wrestling and grapple-heavy game. The vivisection, though, has pointed out that Leonardo looks incredibly uncomfortable as a fighter, as if her run against super athletes has completely broken her. Now, I kind of think that might be true, and that makes me want to pick Boom. But before I watched or listened to it, I was picking Leonardo all the way. I'm going to stick with that. And I'm also going to hope that Leonardo's problems really are just that she has fought a murderer's row of athletic people. Because over the last little bit, she has fought Manon Fiorot, Melissa Gatto, Erin Blanchfield, and Miranda Maverick in 4 of her last 6 fights. I don't necessarily blame her for being absolutely blown out of the water. Like, the least athletic fighter on that list is not even necessarily because she lacks physicality, but like, I guess it'd be Melissa Gatto because of her tendency to allow people to take her down and like at least briefly impose their physicality on her. So like I guess it's her. And like the gap between Boom and Gatto is absolutely huge. So I'm still going to go with Leonardo, but this could be the last time I ever pick her. Because if she does go up there and she does look broken by Mandy Boom, it will be time to hang him up for health, for health, safety, and like probably her own emotional well-being. But it is always a weird thing to tell fighters to retire because you never know what they have going on outside of it. Nicholas Dalby versus Claudio Silva. 2 fighters I really like. They are not perfect fighters by any means. Dalby has some honestly kind of terrible aspects of his game that leads to takedown opportunities. And in Silva's case, he has an incredibly limited game of like power striking mixed with I'm going to choke you the life out of you. Mixed with basically anaconda squeeze. And that does... but at the same time, I've enjoyed their fights. Like they're crazy, sort of like spice of life variety in MMA. They're both getting old. I want to say this is the oldest fight on the card, 37, 39. Yeah, we're talking approaching 80 years between the two of them. Dalby's led a hard life too, it must be said. And they're both probably well past their prime as fighters. I think Silva more so, though. Like, Silva's gotten to the point where, like, he gets tired getting the fight that he wants, and that's never a very good sign. Like, it's one thing to gas out when someone is forcing a pace and a style of fight on you that you don't want or wouldn't be your choice, wouldn't be your A game. And we've seen Silva gas out now in his A game. And we still haven't seen Dalby do that because for all of his flaws in that Tien Means fight, he won the 3rd round. He was still there in the 3rd round, still doing his thing. And he's not the grappler Court McGee is. He's not the grappler James Krause is. But I kind of think he's a good enough grappler to just not get submitted by Claudio Silva. Because he did get tapped by Jesse Ronson back in the day, and that's immediately concerning because Ronson's not an amazing fighter in the grappling game, but I think it caught him by surprise. Whereas with Silva, you have to know what he's trying to do, and that is he is going to try to choke you in various ways, and you should be prepared for that. You should be scrambling. Dalby is a good scrambler. He is good at getting back up. He is actually pretty good at defending takedowns, although he will just kind of like put himself in the worst positions to get taken down. And he's a way better striker. Like he's a legitimately good karate-inspired kickboxer. And Silva's striking game. You remember how I said Kyle Nelson's striking game was like all power? Like Kyle Nelson's striking game is power with like form. Silva's striking game is like power without form. Like it's a lot of winging haymakers and like just the ugliest stuff that kind of works because he'll crash into the clinch with you and at some point choke you. And I just think that those days are past us. I think at 39 years old, Claudio Silva has kind of hit the end of the road. Of being a competitive fighter, I still think I like, and to be clear, I think there's a difference between like what he's going through and like what Leonardo's going through. which is I think Silva can totally just go back and fight some young guys and still strangle them. So I don't even know if retirement is a thing, but like it does feel like the UFC years are kind of done, and it's time to move on to the next chapter of his career. But we'll see. I'm still looking forward to this being a fun fight. They're both aggressive fighters who will be kind of like that sloppy, but like good kind of sloppy. And hopefully we'll get a good fight. So that is the fight card, all 14 fights. And yeah, I don't really have much to add. It's going to be interesting to see where the winner of Aspinall Blaydes goes, I guess, because the division is kind of really tied up and frozen in place without any real resolution in sight. Like I don't know, maybe he ends up facing the winner of this fight ends up facing the winner of Tuivasa and Gone for like some kind of interim belt or something. It'll be interesting though. Either guy, it looks like they're going to be around for a while. They're going to be very good, and they've added other tools. They've diversified, and I appreciate that. And the crowd will be almost certainly electric because they always are. And that's something that even comes through the TV screen. So as per usual, follow me on MMA at Meo Dread. It's in the description below. And also join the Discord for some Fight Nerd fun. And I might have a special guest for the recap that I think is worth getting hyped about. So have a good day.